Okay, so as promised, I'm going to start in on Chris Hedges' The Death of the Liberal Class with his first chapter. Last week I did an introduction to Chris Hedges, so if you are listening to this but you haven't listened to that one, it might be worth going back and just listening to a little bit of his background. But we're going to get right into chapter 1, which is entitled Resistance. And it starts out with a story about a guy named Ernest Belle from New York who is, in a lot of ways, kind of representative of the disillusioned and underemployed white working class guy. I am not going to go into all of his background or anything, but it's a matter of what does Hedges want to get out of the stories he tells about Belle's life. And there's a quote here from Belle. He says, I got out of the Marine Corps and went back to Texas for 10 months and was involved in the John McCain campaign. I really got disillusioned with the neoconservatism. I had never been involved in politics. The idea that we needed all these troops all around the world, defending freedom as they called it, when we were actually engaged in nation building and supporting special interests that drive these wars, was something I began to understand. As far as foreign and economic policy, I could see there was no difference between the two main political parties. There is a false left and a false left-right paradigm which diverts the working class from the real reasons for their hardships. I like that quote because it really sums up, I think, what Hedges is trying to get at by telling Belle's story. This disillusionment with both the left and the right, and this sort of dawning reality on the part of people like Belle that somehow they've been more or less left behind and maybe worse. And so that's the way he chooses to begin his book. And then Hedges observes that Belle's emotions, quote, spring from the failure of the liberal class over the past 3 decades to protect the minimal interests of the working and middle class as corporations dismantled the democratic state, decimated the manufacturing sector, looted the U.S. Treasury, waged imperial wars that can neither be afforded nor won, and gutted the basic laws that protected the interests of the ordinary citizens. So there he sets up, he gives you a hint as to where he's going to lay the blame, which at first seems like it's going to be corporate power, but that's not actually what the book is about. It's about the liberal class, but it is the liberal class's interaction with corporate power that's really at issue in this book. So there you get a taste of where he's going. And one thing I can say for sure right now is that Hedges is really pretty hard-hitting in this book, and he doesn't mince words. He doesn't protect particular sides in this, and so he's very, very frank. He very quickly takes us through a little trip in intellectual history where he talks about the birth of classical liberalism in philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and of course the American founders reflecting that liberalism. And he says that the liberal era that reflected that kind of liberalism came to an end with World War I. He says the war shattered liberal optimism about the inevitability of human progress. It created mass culture, fostered through the consumer society, the cult of self, etc. So World War II, it had, or World War I, I should say, and actually World War II as well, had this huge effect upon the American psyche and upon American liberalism. And so he can say a mutant outgrowth of the liberal class was one that embraced a fervent anti-communism and saw national security as the highest priority. It emerged after World War I, and I would say even more so after World War II. Then he briefly talks about Cold War liberalism. Again, that would be aimed at the communist enemy, and as you know, aiming at the enemy, takes on a new turn towards expansion of capitalism as a sort of ideological commitment. So He says the liberalism shifted into the embrace of globalization, imperial expansion, and unfettered capitalism. This may be a little fast, but he's basically trying to get us up to close to where we are now. But he's saying that these two wars and the Cold War, and the way that Americans dealt with those things led to such a distortion of liberalism that we set ourselves up for some of the problems that we're having now. He says, what endures is not the fact of democratic liberalism, but the myth of it. The myth is used by corporate power elites and their apologists to justify the subjugation and manipulation of other nations in the name of national self-interest and democratic values. Okay, but the real heart of this chapter is where Hedges goes off in a storm of basic, seems like fury and disgust about the liberal class itself and how the liberal class used to be this rather sizable class of people who kept things kind of sane and stable and pushed back against when, let's say, interests in capitalism got too powerful, or when the paranoia against the enemy got too strong. But it stopped pushing back at a certain point. And the way that he introduces this, and he's going to talk about this throughout the rest of his book, but he sort of condenses it here, it's truly, eye-opening. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs of this, okay? He says, corporate power forgot that the liberal class, when it functions, gives legitimacy to the power elite, and reducing the liberal class to courtiers or mandarins who have nothing to offer but empty rhetoric shuts off this safety valve and forces discontent to find other outlets that often end in violence. I'll just stop for a moment there and have you contemplate that, right? Corporate power forgot the liberal class serves a function to give legitimacy to the power elite by reining it in, I would say, right? So they are not able, as I've said before, they're not in a position to rein that power in anymore. They've become weakened or defanged by corporate power, according to Hedges, into being courtiers or mandarins, basically court jesters of sorts. Now you may ask, well, how did that happen? Or you may even ask, is that true? Because, for a lot of people, there's this looming notion of the liberal nabobs in academia or whatever that are basically trying to, I don't know, turn America into some sort of left-wing boogie state. But the way that Hedges deals with that phenomenon is truly eye-opening. I just ask you to stick with me while I read some more of this. He says, the inability of the liberal class to acknowledge that corporations have wrested power from the hands of citizens, that the Constitution and its guarantees of personal liberty have become irrelevant, and that the phrase consent of the governed is meaningless, has left it speaking and acting in ways that no longer correspond to reality. It has lent its voice to hollow acts of political theater and the pretense that democratic debate and choice continue to exist. The liberal class refuses to recognize the obvious because it does not want to lose its comfortable and often well-paid perch. Churches and universities, in elite schools such as Princeton, professors can earn $180,000 a year, enjoy tax-exempt status as long as they refrain from overt political critiques. Labor leaders have lavish salaries and are considered junior partners within corporate capitalism as long as they do not speak in the language of class struggle. Politicians, like generals, are loyal to the demands of the corporate state in power and retire to become millionaires as lobbyists or corporate managers. Artists who use their talents to foster the myths and illusions that bombard our society live comfortably in the Hollywood Hills. The media, the church, the university, the Democratic Party, the arts, and labor unions, the pillars of the liberal class, have been bought off with corporate money and promises of scraps tossed to them by the narrow circles of power. Journalists who prize access to the powerful more than they prize truth report lies and propaganda to propel us into a war in Iraq. Many of these same journalists assured us it was prudent to entrust our life savings to a financial system run by speculators and thieves. Those life savings were gutted. The media, catering to corporate advertisers and sponsors, at the same time renders invisible whole sections of the population whose misery, poverty, and grievances should be the principal focus of journalism. And he doesn't stop there. He says, in the name of tolerance, a word the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. never used, the liberal church and the synagogue refuse to denounce Christian heretics who acculturate the Christian religion with the worst aspects of consumerism, nationalism, greed, imperial hubris, violence, and bigotry. These institutions accept globalization and unfettered capitalism as natural law. Liberal religious institutions, which should concern themselves with justice, embrace a cloying personal piety expressed in "how is it with me" kind of spirituality and small self-righteous acts of publicly conspicuous charity. Years spent in seminary or rabbinical schools, years devoted to the study of ethics, justice, and morality prove useless when it comes time to stand up to corporate forces that usurp religious and moral language for financial and political gain. Universities no longer train students to think critically, to examine and critique systems of power and cultural and political assumptions, to ask the broad questions of meaning and morality once sustained by the humanities. These institutions have been transformed into vocational schools. Well, you see there, he hits every liberal bastion, starting with universities and university professors. And he's going to have a whole chapter on the universities and how university professors allow themselves to basically become little more than hired BB guns for particular corporate interests, lost in academic research that has little impact outside of academia, and involved in cultural struggles that really are only relevant to themselves. If you've ever thought, gosh, those people in academia are so I shouldn't say interesting, so oppressive. This is a new way of looking at it, where basically they're relegated. They don't have any real power. They're relegated to trying to have some influence in their own domain through the use of basically playing semantical games and maybe taking pot shots at their ideological opponents in academia by changing rules using the faculty senate. The way he sees this kind of thing is, this is proof that they have been completely stripped of power. And he hits them all. And so this kind of angry series of accusations kind of outlines the way this book is going to go. He's gonna hit the universities and the professors. He's gonna talk about the church and how it has basically become completely defanged, and people go to church, they don't hear about serious issues. In a lot of cases they hear about feel-good self-help, psychobabble. Journalists who spend a lot of time not necessarily really informing us, but getting us all mesmerized by the latest sensational thing or the latest, hard to ignore act of violence. And the common thread running throughout this critique is that these people in every case have been bought off, that they have been co-opted by their lucrative salaries, and so they have played the game. He hits Bill Clinton. He ends up criticizing Barack Obama in this chapter. He says of Barack Obama, just to give you a taste of that, he raised more than $600 million to run for president, most of it from corporations, and he had served the corporate interests as assiduously as his party. So from Hedges' perspective, yeah, the Republicans have served corporate interests, but so have the Democrats. And I dare say this is partly a source of the anger aimed at the government generally that led to the recent unpleasantness, you might say, is that the people like the guy that Hedges features in the beginning of this are beginning to become very disillusioned with both of these traditional parties and with the whole, you know, I don't know, all the messages that they receive from the cultural liberal class that don't ever get translated into any sort of reality and seem to be really beside the point, or, you know, haggling over small details, but never quite getting around to changing anything. So I won't belabor this chapter. I promised that I would basically zero in on what each chapter, kind of the highlights of it, and there you have this one. It sets up the book really well. It gives you the promise of what's to come, and the next chapter is called Permanent War. So I will see you next time. Bye.